Good evening to you all, and welcome back to the second session of the International Media Seminar hosted by the Department of Media and Communication Studies, JIMS Vasant Kunj. I welcome Dr. Daya Thusu. Dr. Daya Thusu is one of the most respected minds in academia, and his impressively lengthy list of accomplishments is nothing short of spectacular. Dr. Daya Thusu is Professor of International Communications at School of Communication, Hong Kong Baptist University, and in 2018-2019, he was a visiting distinguished professor and inaugural Disney Chair in Global Media at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, Beijing. For many years, he was Professor of International Communication at the University of Westminster in London, where he was also co-founder and co-director of India Media Center and research advisor to the China Media Center. Author or editor of 20 books, the latest being a co-edited collection, BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order. Amongst his other main publications are International Communication, Continuity and Change, third edition of China's Media Go Global, which is co-edited by him, Electronic Empires, Media on the Move, Global Flow and Contraflow, News as Entertainment, The Rise of Global Infotainment, Internationalizing Media Studies, Media and Terrorism, Global Perspectives, which again he has co-edited, and Communicating India's Soft Power, Buddha to Bollywood, and Mapping BRICS Media, again co-edited by him. He is currently writing a book to be titled Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. Professor Thusu is the founder and managing editor of the SAGE journal, Global Media and Communication, and he's also series editor of two Routledge book series, Internationalizing Media Studies and Routledge Advances in Internationalizing Media Studies. Dr. Daya Thusu, may I please request you to kindly address the participants?
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm sorry I have not been able to attend the morning sessions because I'm speaking to you from London. So it was a bit awkward in terms of time. So I'm glad that I've got a good slot. I'm very grateful for Dr. Ravi Dhar for his initial invitation, and Dr. Neeru Johri, who wrote me a more formal invitation, and then Ruchi Goyal for her help in organizing this talk. I have a very deep interest in what's happening in the digital space in India, because Indian internet is the world's largest open internet. And given that India has still 700 million people who are not online. So in the next 10 years, it is going to be even more important terrain for politics, for economics, for culture, for sociology, for communication studies. So it's a fantastic area of research and scholarship. So what I thought I'll do in today's short time I have is to I've titled it Digital India Divides and Dividends. But before I talk specifically on India, I would rather talk a little bit about the kind of international context within which internet in India is evolving. I have a short PowerPoint presentation to share with you, and let me see if I can share screen if I have permission. Yes, I do. So can you guys see it? Can somebody tell me that it is visible?
Yes, sir, it's visible. Do go ahead.
And I should have asked this before, but the audio is okay? The sound
absolutely fine, sir. Crystal clear.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. So before I start, I just made one sort of technical admission. I'm not very good at multitasking. So if somebody sends me a comment in the chat box, I may not be able to respond because, as I say, I'm not very good with changing screens so easily. But hopefully we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the session. But also my email is there. This is my private email. You can also find my work email if you type my name, HKBU website. And so I'll be very happy to continue the conversation if need be. So digital India divides and dividends, it's quite a mouthful and also quite a big topic for a short presentation. So I thought what I will talk about is first to kind of contextualize where this internet is in relation to the world at large, because we are not an island. And in this age of digital connectivity, we are, in fact, very dependent on, especially for our infrastructure, digital infrastructure. And then I want to talk about what are the great dividends that internet has offered in terms of economics, electronic commerce, for instance, but also in terms of media and communication, and most importantly for a country like ours, for developmental purposes. And then I'll end with a few reflections about the divides, how the cyberspace is also creating probably the worst kind of social divide, hate mongering, the defiling of public discourse, the debasing of debate, something which is so un-Indian in my view. We are a polite society. And what I see, especially on social media today, and also in mainstream legacy media, is, to say the least, disquieting. So let me just start with a kind of general figure around the world of how big this internet world is, digital world is. 67% of the world's population is using a smartphone, mobile phone. 62% plus is using internet. Active media, social media users, again, nearly 60%. These are last year's figures, and these figures change on a weekly basis, especially in big population societies like India, Indonesia, Brazil, etc. So it gives you a sense of how big this world of digital communication is. And India is a very important part of it, not only because, as I said, it's the largest internet in the world, largest open internet, that is, because the largest one is China, that's not open. And this has also had an impact on what Manuel Castells has called a kind of network society that we all live in. Networks have become very important, and it is now a global mobile network society, as increasingly people are connecting to this network of networks. Sorry, there's an echo. Can people mute themselves, please? So what are the features of this networked mobile media world we are living in? Strong consumer orientation, mobility, and personalization. We have become a commodity in this media age, we individuals, because we get free content, and in lieu of that, we give our personal information to these platforms. So it's very strong consumer orientation, very strong personalization, and of course, mobility. So they know exactly what we like, what we don't like. We tell them like and unlike. Interactivity. Of course, I'm not on social media, so I don't know how actually it happens, despite the fact that I teach this. But I'm on WhatsApp though, I have to say, but it's impossible today to manage without being in one of those platforms. And also interactivity is an integral part of this this digital world. Immediacy and continual updates. Now, think of journalism, for instance. In the past, in my previous avatar, I used to be a journalist, both in India, in Delhi, and also in London. And it was a very different journalism, all over the world. You did your story, and then you went to the restaurant or the pub, and then you didn't worry about it until it's in print next day. Even television was very relaxed. Today, they are working against impossible deadlines, and deadlines every second. And a journalist today has to be multi-talented, multi-media personality. She should be able to, after filing her story, to be on doing a podcast, to be on Twitter, be on Facebook Live, etc., etc. So immediacy has become very important. And in the process, the context, the gatekeeping, all those factors which make journalism different from mere information is increasingly under pressure all over the world. And particularly so in a country of India's size and complexity. And yet there's a greater degree of information available in this world of digital connectivity. Extraordinary amount of information is available. Within a few seconds, you can access information. So you were looking at, for instance, Ukraine situation today, and much of what we are seeing is coming from certainly certain sources, Western sources, largely Anglo-American sources. But you can easily go and look at what the Russians are saying. Within a few minutes, you can find it in English language. So huge variety of sources available, and yet there is a tendency, because we are living in this age of information overload, the attention span is very limited. So although there is a lot of information, but we don't really go beyond the headline. We read the headline and then we move on. So the depth and context, especially contextual accuracy in journalism, which was fundamental, is gone. And increasingly, it's a very cursory examination. Now, this whole system is essentially controlled by a very few hugely powerful companies, mostly based, well, exclusively based in the United States. And as you see on this slide, their market capitalization is bigger than many GDPs in the world. In fact, Apple announced recently, a few weeks ago, that its market capitalization was $3 trillion. Which is as big as the economy of India, which is the 6th largest economy in the world in GDP terms, absolute GDP terms, and purchasing power parity terms is the 3rd largest economy. So just put it in the context what it means to have $3 trillion as a market capitalization. Of course, these figures can be manipulated, managed, but you get a drift of how big their operations are. They got so much money, they don't know what to do with it. And it's no coincidence that Google and Microsoft and now Twitter is basically the top people there, the topmost people have their first degrees in India. And that's an interesting connection. I'll refer to that again. Also in terms of infrastructure, not just the kind of content that you see, but infrastructure, the hardware of digital world is also very much dominated by these companies. So if you look at this was a piece that New York Times published last year, internet cables in service by 2021, and you see the ones with the yellow are Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. Of course, there are others also. China is very big in this, especially in relation to Africa and other southern continent, southern part of the world. So that's again worth remembering that we are operating in so it's one of the kind of divides that we do, digital divides. We have Digital India as a great project, but actually the infrastructure that we're using is not necessarily Indian. Even more problematic is the browsers. Chrome, which is Google, accounts for nearly 66% of global share of browsers, followed by Safari, Microsoft, Edge, Microsoft, then Samsung, Firefox, sorry, Internet Explorer, etc. QQ is Chinese, Yandex is Russian. So American companies account for something in the range of 90% plus of the browsers. So you don't have browsers, you can't access, right? So again, it's very important to keep these things in mind, that this is absolutely fundamental in terms of understanding how internet operates, how digital world operates. And it's also worth reminding ourselves that internet has its history in security and Pentagon. It's not a civil project. It came out of a military project. It's part of the Cold War, the old Cold War. And this power is exercised in various ways and quite explicitly. For instance, you remember this in 2021, as the election results were coming out, the most powerful personality in the world, so the US president, was deplatformed. So just think of you and me, we have no status whatsoever. If they can do that to the president of the United States. Of course, they did it after they knew that he's lost power. Although we know that this contested election, but that's a different story itself, in itself. So extraordinary power. And most recently, we've seen how this social media, for instance, has been weaponized in the case of Ukraine. Meta, which is the company that owns Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., most powerful companies in the world, and Nick Clegg, who used to be he was the deputy prime minister here in London. He's now a very senior person in Meta. They said very clearly that they can use that, they will allow that platform to be used for anti-Russian hate, violating their own guidelines. Right? So if you were looking at social media coverage of what's happening in Ukraine, you would think that everything that's wrong in that part of the world is confined to one person who's sitting in Moscow. Yeah, it's a madman theory. These people don't think rationally, so we got to tell them what to do. And then this is fact checkers get together. It's another interesting sub kind of plot in this. We're going to fact check. And again, this is happening, and they feed information to media. And you have the hackers getting together. That we will actually do everything in our power. This is the anonymous group. Everything in our power to disable information warfare from Russia. So it's very well documented. I'm just giving you a flavor of what is the bigger picture is. Now, within that, one has to think of digital India and think of what our strengths and weaknesses are. And there are many. For a start, the scale of the internet in India is phenomenal. The growth is extraordinary. The only comparison we can draw is China. And I've been very fortunate. I spent a year in Beijing, and I've been visiting China since 2004. I used to be the research advisor of China Media Center at University of Westminster in London, which had very good links with Chinese universities. And in that capacity, I also had the privilege to meet a lot of Chinese scholars, policy people in London and as well in China. And then you see how it has evolved. And so, of course, that's a different internet. And this lecture is not on that, probably some other time. But the Indian one is, again, phenomenal growth. From 5 million, just over 5 million people 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, to today is 800 million people. Right, and again, the availability of mobile internet, and again, China factor is important because 60% of the smartphones in India are still Chinese made. So it is in terms of scale, extraordinary, but also what is to come, because as I said at the beginning, there are still, if 800 million are online, that means another 600 million are not online. So if you're a Google or a Facebook, you realize this is the market. We can't go to China, that's blocked. So where do we go? And therefore, they have done everything they can to be cuddly with our Prime Minister. Mr. Modi, you remember he went to California, he had a town kind of, what is it called, the kind of public meeting with Mr. Zuckerberg and also other top CEOs, and created a kind of equation with them. And it's not, I mean, it's not altruistic, it's very practical. India needs that expertise, but they need the market. Although it's not like United States or Western Europe or Japan, it's a relatively poor market, but the scale is so massive and the potential is so great. I also put geo here because, again, people forget how important geo is in terms of Indian internet. And you cannot imagine a country of size and complexity of India to manage by just the state. State doesn't have the resources, right? Even in China, where this is state capitalism, the Tencents of the world and Alibabas of the world are private companies with huge, in fact, more kind of ruthlessly, aggressively capitalistic than any company you can imagine in Europe or US. So one of the reasons these guys are so interested is big market, WhatsApp, 400 million people, Facebook, 320, I think it's now, Instagram, etc. In fact, the largest audience for Meta is in India, which is not surprising given our demographics also, which is 70% of Indians are below the age of 35. To translate into actual numbers, we're talking about the entire population of Western Europe and United States combined. And many of these are increasingly educated, upwardly mobile, English fluent, technologically savvy. And of course, if you're a Google or a Facebook, that's where you want to be. And if you have a local partner, Sone pe suhaga, as you say. Now, geo's growth is, again, phenomenal. Future historians would wonder, how could they, started in 2016, and by 2020, they were like 300 million. And today, I think it's much higher already. And of course, this can't happen without state support. And this is a fallacy to assume that Facebook and Twitter and Google has done it on its own. They have very clear and explicit backing of the United States government. So it's not just the Chinese who do it or Russians who do it. Everybody does it. And I think we should kind of grow more mature and understand that you need that support. Without that, you cannot acquire the scale that is required in a country of that size. Similarly, what's happening with online retail and the general electronic commerce. In fact, last year, mobile transactions in India were the largest in the world. They were more than China. Now that's saying something, because Chinese mobile communication is the most sophisticated. I emphasize, most sophisticated in the world. So if China is, and the scale, China is 1.4 billion people. So if we have surpassed that, that is an extraordinary achievement. And this is already operating across various, geo is operating across various verticals, whether it is healthcare, social networking, publishing, streaming, etc. And if you compare that with the big guys in the field, Alibaba, Amazon, in a relatively short period of time, it's only 7 years when it was established, 2015, it is already, as per this is again a year-old, 22 verticals where geo was operating. So this is again I think something I see as a dividend, that there is a very strong corporate interest. And again, they're not doing it for charity, they're doing it for business. And there's this kind of convergence both between the state and domestic capital, as well as international capital and technology. So for instance, Google and both Google and Facebook have direct dealings with Geo. But it happened at there was an infrastructure in place behind this, which is Aadhaar, a certain connectivity, which, when it was introduced, people were making lots of snide remarks about it. Even the current government spokespersons of the government were saying, oh, this is just waste of money. And now we realize how phenomenally important this has been. Not for people like you and me, we don't matter, but people who are on the bottom of the pyramid in India. Think of JAM, Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar and mobile, that deadly combination. And just imagine if we didn't have that and the pandemic had hit us. You would have famine in India. You would have riots in India. So you got to bow to Nandan Nilekani and people like him. Thank you, sir. You did a phenomenal job. This much maligned government did it. It was not done by Western NGOs. It's our technology. And it's an extraordinarily important infrastructure. People of middle class, my friends, said, oh, this is, they're going to surveillance us and they're going to spy on us. That was their concern, not that there is actually this, the people who deserve the most, the basic access that's been given to them. And we've seen it's, how it has worked. For instance, in terms of public communication, with the whole vaccination issue, this connectivity has been a phenomenally important factor. As have been applications, apps like Arogya Setu. Now, we see those in Europe or in Korea or Japan or even China, but these societies are much more technical. People are much more educated. The infrastructure is infinitely better. But to be able to do that in a relatively underdeveloped digital infrastructure is a very important and very significant development. It's also something to do with not just big corporates and big government, because they're important, but it's also something to do with the ingenuity of Indians as people. This picture went viral during the lockdown. Now just look at this. There's the kind of ingenuity involved in that. This is a teacher taking a class with the mobile phone is hanging with a hanger on a plastic chair. Now, this is just extraordinary. So the genius that one, the creativity, the originality of it is extraordinary. Makes one's proud that people manage in extraordinary circumstances. If the Americans had to do, they'll just go mad. And it is. Right? There's a distance and there's COVID, so you need milk. Again, it's a very desi jugaad, as this a very successful one. So again, in terms of dividends, there's phenomenal kind of resources there, both state, corporate, and ordinary people. But then also these can be misused, these connections, these networks, and they are being misused, whether by politicians, by other groups, by corporates to There's a very interesting book which came out a couple of years ago by Professor Zoff in Harvard, Susanna Zoff, and the book is called Surveillance Capitalism. Right. So it's not just the state is doing surveillance, the corporates are doing surveillance. They know exactly what you buy, sell, etc. So, and that then leads to the question of regulation. How do you try to regulate a chaotic system like this, where everybody with a smartphone is potentially a journalist, where information of all kinds travel instantly and goes viral all over the world. So we have, in terms of one of the problems India has, digital India has, is the regulatory mechanism is still in its infancy. And by the way, that's not a particularly unusual situation. Much of the global South, one would argue, is in a similar position. And I would argue India is actually much better than many other developing countries. But as it is so, as I indicated at the beginning, the scale is so huge and it's happened so quickly that the regulation, the legislation is yet to catch up with it. But even in more kind of commercialized environments, United States, for example, there's already a discussion going on about how this extraordinary power of the tech giants need to be moderated, controlled. Elizabeth Warren, one of the senior politicians in the United States, she had this whole campaign last year, break up Facebook, Google, and Amazon, this against monopolization of digital power. This is more within the US context. But what the Europeans have done is even more interesting in terms of privacy, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And that's something which many other countries are finding interesting to adapt to their own situation. And in India, we don't particularly care a lot about privacy. And I think in the digital space, this is becoming a very important issue. And again, the government and civil society groups, academics, journalists also have to get together to think of a regulatory framework which is suitable to our conditions. Now, one way of thinking about that is to, think of indigenous solutions. So I mentioned Aadhaar earlier. That's a very Indian idea. And if we had a slightly more intelligent government, they would sell that idea to 80% of the world. Because it's a very, very good idea. Similarly, the debates surrounding regulation, privacy, etc., again, have to be in an Indian context. But India is not the only country, jostling with these, because as I said, they're constantly changing technologies, sort of 10 years ahead of regulation. And there are such huge pressures. I mentioned earlier, if you're sitting with $3 trillion, you can do anything. You can buy up the whole establishment. And that's what is another complicating factor. But what is happening today as we speak in Ukraine? And has a lot of people sort of think about, we cannot allow this kind of control of digital space to essentially a few American companies. And when I was being introduced, one of my books was mentioned. A book came out last year. BRICS Media is for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It was a big project. I was involved in Finland. And this is the third book of the project, final book. And we were talking about BRICS, and we think, okay, BRICS is sort of, it's an historical importance. It's gone. But what happened in the last 2 months is really, in some ways, resurrected this notion. In fact, the Russian finance minister said that BRICS nations should develop their own version of SWIFT, this international financial exchange, which the Americans and Europeans have dominated. And in that book, I had a chapter which I titled as BRICS De-Americanizing the Internet. So this idea of de-Americanizing the Internet is, I think, an interesting one to be thinking about in view of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And India has, given its size and scale, India has a very important role to play in that process. That is not to say that you sever any ties with these big companies in America, but you have to think of more precise ways in which you can indigenize the internet, and that really is about the infrastructure. Let me then come to the final slide that I want to share with you, and a few points I want to make about some of the key issues that I think are relevant to digital India. They're not necessarily India-specific issues, but given the scale numbers involved in India, they are of primary significance, and because I'm addressing an Indian audience, I think it's important to see it in the Indian context. So, will we have an Indian internet? We have the largest open internet, but is it Indian? Are our platforms Indian? The apps that we use, are they Indian? Does it matter that they are not Indian? So we got over 1 billion mobile telephones in India. We have yet to produce an Indian mobile telephone. We're using Apple, is a Chinese made, using South Korean ones. And then you see when they have so many phenomenally clever Indians who are working in top positions in the United States, why haven't they developed an Indian phone? How did Chinese do it? I mean, this is a very basic question. We should be asking that. The IIT was set up in 1950s, much before there was anything similar in China. So, the questions that are important in any discussion of digital India, the first one is a bigger question about cyber sovereignty. And this again leads to this debate about de-Americanization. As you would appreciate, there isn't a global body, a UN supported body, which says, okay, this is how internet should be managed, regulated. Right. And therefore, in a digital space, I mean, the territoriality has a very different definition. It is aterritorial. So how do you then protect your cyberspace? Right? Some of us are old enough to remember the Cold War, when even satellite TV was jammed in parts of Eastern Europe, in China, because they're getting all this invasion from the sky. Right? And today's age of 24/7 connectivity, notions of sovereignty have changed. But I think this is one area where we need to be thinking very seriously about how do we protect our own cyber sovereignty. Data localization, again, very important, given that India has the cheapest data in the world, and after China, the largest data in the world. And Mr. Ambani, in fact, said 2 years ago, I think it was, at a public rally where the Prime Minister was in attendance, that we need to. This is the kind of the other colonial war against data colonization. It's an anti-colonial war. So Mahatma Gandhi fought the first colonial war. We should fight a new colonial war against data. Data being being commodified and sold. And again, if you think about data centers, for instance, in India, they're very few in comparison to, say, China. I've had the privilege to go to some of their data centers in central China, and just to put it simply, it's very impressive. So a lot of work to be done there. Cyber war and hacktivism. I already referred to it in the case of Ukraine conflict, but this is now an integral part of any warfare. You can disable a country's transport if hackers, active hackers. So again, the infrastructure to deal with that is still very small, given the requirement. The expertise in our universities, we're teaching kids, how to write a news story, which is fine because they're doing journalism, they should do that. But they also have to understand the digital environment within which they are operating. Again, a very important area and a kind of divide in that sense, because we are so behind in comparison to many other countries. I mean, comparable countries. E-commerce and m-commerce, of course, I already mentioned the fact that the mobile transactions last year in India were the highest in the world. And we have, don't need to emphasize that point, a lot of people are still extremely poor in India. But one thing this pandemic did was it forced people to go digital. And sometimes we perhaps do not give it the importance it deserves. That, Jan Dhan Yojana happened because the government of India, in its wisdom, opened 200 million bank accounts for the poorest of the poor with zero balance. Right? So the infrastructure was created within which these, not just kind of middle class people, you and me buying stuff on Amazon or its equivalent, but poorest people having access to technology. Then the worrying one, toxicity of the social media world. I started by referring to this, the hate factories that exist today. It is actually quite distressing to see the venom that circulates in digital superhighways, and the way then it is forwarded. And in a country where there are so many problems, whether we should be reciting Hanuman Chalisa at what decibel is a kind of national debate, when there are millions of people who don't have basic needs. So I think, this is something, again, it comes into the regulation element I mentioned earlier, but also as students of journalism or communication personalities, and they have to take an extra level of responsibility to deal with these hate factories. They're not emanating from one particular group. They have various, originators for various reasons, whether it's political, whether it is cultural, sociological, whatever. But that's one area which requires, I think, a very urgent attention. As does the increasing presence of fake news in this age of deep fakes. You can put somebody's face in somebody's body, somebody's voice in someone else's face. And now the technology is becoming so sophisticated, it is not always possible for an average person to distinguish between the fake and the real. And this is a legend. Every day on social media, there are stories which circulate, which are obviously fake. I mean, obviously fake. And these are sent. I mean, I'm not, as I said, I'm not on these, but I'm on WhatsApp. And then I think, what's happened to these educated people? How can they forward this, which is patently absurd, which is patently false? So it's again a very, in terms of journalism, very, very important because, as I said at the very beginning, there's this age of immediacy that the deadline has to be every second. So people do not have the time or energy or inclination to double check, right? And since they're reading the headlines, they're not reading the story. And therefore, the fake news gets much greater. And again, there have been studies in various places to show why fake news is more, it's clickbaits help fake news, right? So that's another factor. But in India, given that India has such an amazingly diverse media landscape, so many languages, so many layers of conversation, that it is even more important than in a more monolingual country like United States. And that leads to my final point to students especially, that one of the extraordinary empowering things that digital connectivity has done is to open up the whole world to you. A few clicks and you can find anything. And that's your choice, what you want to read or watch. It's free. When I was a student, I went to a top university. I was at JNU, the much maligned university today. I did my PhD there. And if you wanted to photocopy an article, you had to stand in the queue and you got a very bad, black stained photocopier, and you get little, and then you read it and you made notes on it. Today, you can get a PDF within 30 seconds of the latest report, which has come out from some, academic work or think tank or United Nations, etc. So there's one aspect. The other aspect is that there are so many people who have actually, we're talking about millions of people here, who have transited from illiteracy or semi-literacy to visual world. They've missed on the literacy part. So you can't write a sentence properly in any language. And because you've seen videos, you're looking at TikTok or its equivalent. And in the process, there is a real issue about literacy. In a country where where this whole idea of education is so important, with this whole tradition of gurus, people educate because they are interested in educating. They're not making money in the bargain. That culture is under attack. And I think it's particularly important that we take the digital literacy issue very, very seriously. And I think journalism students and communication scholars and practitioners have to take that very, very seriously, rather than contributing to the continuous defiling and debasing of public discourse. Don't leave that to politicians. Unfortunately, we don't get the best people in public life. Again, it's documented the numbers of people who sit in the parliament who have records, criminal records against them, probably the largest proportion in any decent democracy. So don't expect public discourse to emerge from these forums. It has to come from academia. It has to come from the civil society. It has to come from the basic decency that our culture has, that you don't use bad language in public. On that note, I'll stop. Thank you so much for listening. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thusu. What a wonderful presentation, pregnant with keen analysis and deep thought, whether it was you mourning the death of contextual accuracy in journalism or reflecting on the concentration of media in the hands of a few monetarily superior companies, and parallelly the concentration of power in the hands of a few digital companies. I think the autonomy of the internet is something that is of concern to everyone, and the localization and the decentralization of the internet is, again, a very genuine concern. So thank you for reflecting on that for us. We do have a few questions from the students, if you'd be so kind as to answer them. And before I move forward, students need to fill the Google form that will be shared in the chat box right away. This is your feedback form and your attendance link. Right. Dr. Thuso, the first question that has come to me is, how would you interpret the present media regulatory regime in comparison with other developed countries? Would you like me to repeat that? I think you're muted, sir. Okay, if you can just unmute, sir. Sir is on mute. Just give me a second, sir. Yes, are you not able to mute yourself, sir? Unmute yourself?
Yes, now I can.
All
Thank
right,
you.
all right.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Would you like me to repeat the question for you?
Yes, please, because I was
Sure.
bothered with technology. Yes.
No worries. How would you interpret the present media regulatory regime in comparison with other developed countries?
Well, it's we are increasingly moving towards. There are two aspects to regulation. One is this kind of the idea of self-regulation, that we are a democratic country. We don't want the state to be intervening with what we, produce, and there are certain guidelines that we need to not to cross. And that's a good model in a country of as diverse a media situation as in India. But I think there is also so that's sort of general point about regulation, but especially in terms of digital media. In most countries, actually, it is still very early stages to provide a very coherent regulatory mechanism. We're talking about democracy here. So, in China, it's a very different game. It's totally controlled by the state. There is no debate, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. But even in more advanced democracies, for instance, in Western Europe, the debate is about, the regulatory mechanism is still underdeveloped because the nature of the beast itself, the digital, anybody, as I said, can put out stuff there. And now increasingly, what is on Twitter or what is in other social media platform feeds into mainstream media so frequently and so regularly that the old notions of regulating media have really been overtaken by technology. So it's very difficult to give a very precise answer in terms of how it compares. But I think, so India also has, because of the, again, this is like regular reports produced about this to say that India is one of the countries where, pages kind of disabled or brought down Facebook pages, Twitter tweets, etc., is one of the highest in the world, because we also have, I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of toxic stuff circulating. We have had cases where people have died because what has been, put on social media. We have had riots most recently we've seen in the last few weeks. So it's a very complicated. So India is in many ways quite unique, right? So there have to be a very India-specific regulatory systems. And as I was saying in my talk, that has still it's just early stages because we haven't really had the. So if I was to ask you, not just you personally, but generally to this audience, that where in India, which university would you go to find a decent course on media regulation?
Right.
Because we don't teach these things.
Yes, we don't.
Right. And India needs its own discourse about how do you regulate. Just think of which other country has so many languages.
Right.
We took the whole of Western Europe, and then Western European, educational standards are much higher, infrastructure is far better, right? We have to see in that context, and I think there is still, so comparison is okay, but we should think of our own indigenous system, which is suited to our own situation.
Absolutely, and therein lies the challenge for the toxic content as well. So if we can help understand, if you could help decode for our students, what would be the parameters to judge this toxic content, if we had to pinpoint, and I'm sure that is a tough task, but if we had to help decode, understand for our students, what would you say?
Well,
What?
there are actually, certain very clearly defined no's and don'ts, right? So hate speech is banned in most countries, including India. But it is people don't. We are famously not a law-abiding society, right? So, and our regulatory systems are not that rigorous, unless they are politically motivated. So that's a different debate altogether. So it's not very difficult to find out what is acceptable or not. There is a list of things that the government produces, and and organizations have their most decent media organizations have their own kind of guidelines that you can't show this kind of stuff, and you can't use this language, etc. It is not so much about the legacy media. They still have a tradition of what is acceptable or not acceptable. The problem is in the other beast, the social media, and there is still very early stages. It's, as I was saying earlier, the whole debasing of debate is so frightening to me personally, because I grew up in India and worked in India, where in public discourse, you just felt odd to say anything horrible about any community, right? And today it has become acceptable to say things which would be considered quite, impolite is the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
Indecent, yes, I understand.
Indecent, absolutely. Yes.
You're right, sir. So we are from that generation where we are not as verbal and as verbose as these digital natives are. And today, the audience that is hearing you comprises of digital natives. These are Gen Zers, very verbose, very verbal, and they don't hesitate to put their opinions out there, toxic or not. So thank you for that, and thank you for being so patient in answering questions for the students. Good evening, Dr. Dhar. Welcome to the media seminar, second session. And I now request Dr. Dhar, Director of JIMS Vasant Kunj, to propose the vote of thanks. Good afternoon, sir. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Neha, for beautifully comparing this session. I'm extremely thankful to Professor Daya Chasu, because the time was very short when we approached him and we requested him to be a part of this seminar. And this was my very long desire of long years, that somehow we should involve him in any event, in any session that we hold in this department, in this institute. And luckily this time he could find some time for us and be with us and give a beautiful and very comprehensive presentation on the state of the internet, both at the international level and as well as at the national level. And what I believe is very important for all our students to note was that at the international level, there is a kind of a monopolization by a handful of media houses and by a handful of networking agencies, as a result of which what happened, I think, in the case of legacy media has somehow got repeated in the case of new media as well. That is, most of it is getting localized in the Anglo-American space, particularly in America or in Britain. So most of the communication discourse is emerging from there, and that's why the narrativization also gets affected because of that. And then the data centers, which were all located over there. But what is very important for us to understand is, as Professor Dayatusu has told us, is that India is emerging. Despite all this, India is emerging, and the references he made to Aadhaar, which is something very phenomenal. 1.3 billion people getting connected to Aadhaar, and as he rightly said it, during the pandemic, there would have been a famine, there would have been riots had it not been for Aadhaar, which made it possible for the government to have targeted delivery of services, social services to the marginalized sections of the population, food delivery, financial help extended to such families. And then the emergence of new corporates in India, the case study of Geo, a fantastic study, an organization which is born much later compared to Bharti and others in this space, and suddenly taking the whole scene by storm and emerging at the top. And then the rise in the number of internet users in India, that in itself is an interesting study, particularly in the later phase, 2015 onwards. If you if you noticed the percentage variation, percentage jump in the number of internet users, that is remarkable. And that is what is going to make us a network society. But of course, the flip side and the warning thoughts and warning signs are that the use of the debasement of the discourse on the social media, that is something which is very deplorable and something which we will have to check, and particularly when people who are educated, because as he said that we have short-circuited the movement and we've moved to visual literacy. Literacy has been left in the loop, and yet we have these educated people who are talking on the social media, and the kind of language they use, that would make any person very uncomfortable, and it's very difficult to then enter into a discourse. There is no logic over there. There is no argument over there. It is just a kind of a street brawl, a verbal street brawl that is happening on the social media. And that, I think, is very dangerous, because if we would like the new media to emerge as that place, that sphere, as a kind of a public sphere where debate and discussion can take place to give a new direction to public policy in India, then I think we would have to do something about it. And that was one of the greatest problems that Professor Dayatusu indicated to us. And I think that is something which we have all been talking about. And fake news, and that of course has been much in the news, and fake news we have been talking about a number of times. We had seminars also on fake news. But then there is also the question of narrativization of history that the West has done with India, as a result of which Indian history has been totally botched up by these Westerns, what I would say Western oriented historians, and because they had an agenda in depriving us of the true pride that we should have had in our past, and making us believe that what is there in the Vedas is the blabbering of a savage race, which is much against what the truth is, what the facts actually speak out. So fake news has always been there. That is what my contention is. And I think at the same time, we should not be, when we have to present, I think there's no harm. We are a rational race. The kind of work we have produced in Vedic mathematics, astronomy, astrology, all the sciences, the technologies that have been developed in this country, I don't think we need to resort to fake news to put across our point. We must stand on the legs of logic and intuition later to look up to the world and look into the eyes of the Western world and put across our point of view with authenticity and with tenacity. So that is what I believe is we should be doing. But I'm really thankful to Professor Dayatusu. I'm really very overjoyed that he is here today with us, because this was really my heart's desire. that we should have him in one of our sessions here. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. And next time, probably come in person and visit your campus in
That would be fantastic.
As you know, I have family in Delhi, so
yeah. You do have family in Delhi. You had a plan to come to Delhi, I think, but somehow probably that plan changed.
Well, COVID has put everything on hold, hasn't it? So, and has not been traveling much. But hopefully, I might be in Delhi in the autumn at some point. I'll let you know if I'm coming.
And for the benefit of all the students, particularly, I think, although Neha has already must have told you about his accomplishments, Professor Daya Tusu is a leading communication expert. He's been coming out with an international journal which has made a mark everywhere.
Okay.
He is a name, well-recognized name in the International Association for Media and Communication Research and in other fora. So I think it is a privilege for our students to have been listening to him and to learn from him. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Yeah, and I hopefully visit you personally. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Bye-bye. I'm going to say goodbye now. Bye.
Bye. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you, sir. We now move on to the last phase of our international media seminar, which is the technical session. We will now have presentations by research scholars and academicians. And we will begin with Ms. Yashmita, who's a research scholar of the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration. And Ms. Yashmita will be speaking on a deeper look into e-governance of the higher education institutions of developing countries. Ms. Yashmita, we request you to share your presentation, please.